So today I thought we'd talk about the aspect of global warming that I think, or climate change as it's now known, that comes to mind first, I think, which is just plain old heat. The underlying problem and the underlying issue, of course, is, as I described in the first session, that the amount of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere is increasing, specifically carbon dioxide, and that is making the world hotter, to just put it in the most simple terms. And as I showed you on the chart, what it's doing is it's trapping more heat in the Earth, and therefore requiring the Earth to get hotter in order to radiate a sufficient amount of heat to keep the planet in energy balance with its surroundings, which must happen. That's a law of physics. So that equilibrium has to be maintained. If the atmosphere is essentially preventing heat from radiating, making it harder for the Earth to radiate, the Earth has to get hotter in order to radiate the amount necessary to keep it in balance, and that's what will happen. So there have been a number of studies done over the past years. Let me just actually go on to the, well, I don't have it, but you may remember I showed you just the average temperature increase, but this is a map showing different areas of the world and the amount of increase in surface temperature during the period from 1951 to 1980 and what's projected for the future. And there are various projections in the United States. So here's a map of our country showing what the trends are in terms of temperature change. And this is way in the future now. You can see this is for the end of the century. But again, you can see this is actually pretty dramatic. It's not clear that much increase will take place. So there are various projections and there are various models. This particular model is based on the idea that we don't do anything at all to abate the increase in the use of greenhouse gas, and furthermore, that the increase is proportionate with the rate of economic growth we already have. So, of course, the issue is that every country wants to grow, every country wants to become more prosperous. You can see even in our political debates now about the presidency, what do people want? More jobs, more growth. Okay, so if we and other countries in the world continue to use that as their measure of success, and we continue to use or to produce the same amount of carbon dioxide, we burn the same amount of carbon in order to achieve that growth, then this is the projection for what will happen by the end of the century, and this is catastrophe. As I think I mentioned, when the Ice Age occurred, the last Ice Age, and North America was covered down to at least its midpoint by glaciers, that was a result of a 6 degrees centigrade, about a 9 or 10 degree Fahrenheit change in temperature. That was enough. That amount of temperature change was enough to cover half of North America in 1,000-foot sheets of ice. So you can just picture what would happen if there was an equivalent increase in temperature over what we have now, and what kind of impact that would have on the climate. So that's a kind of a worst case scenario, and that's what motivated me to write the book I'm going to talk about. So what I'm going to do today is talk about this book I wrote and give you a chance to ask questions about that, and then also talk about two other books that are quite similarly themed. They also deal with heat, although those books deal with places of refuge, places people went to, or in the novel, of course, imaginary places, but places people went to escape from the heat, and specifically the heat in the United States. So all three books are set in our own country, in the United States. I thought as a lead-up, I just sort of summarized a little bit the themes that we talked about in the course up to this point. So you'll recall there was, we talked about the development of science fiction as a genre and its relationship to our concepts of knowledge, our structure of knowledge, and the reason why science fiction has become such a dominant genre in popular literature and in motion pictures because of its relationship to the way we think about the world and our theories of truth and so on and so forth. And then about the development of post-apocalyptic and dystopian science fiction. Post-apocalyptic science fiction is science fiction that portrays a world after a disaster. And if you look in the early part of the 19th century, and going back indeed to the Renaissance, there were a lot of utopian books about how, where an author would present his view of an ideal world, the original one being Sir Thomas More's Utopia. The word means no place in Latin, which is what he and everybody else who wrote the book in as scholars. He was a scholar. So he wrote this book, Utopia. I mentioned it as drawing from the age of exploration, and Utopia is a newly discovered island, so it represents the knowledge structure of his time, and then going on into probably the most famous in our own country, Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward 2000 to 1887, which was a bestseller at the time. Only specialists, only historians read these now, because it turns out that writing about a time when everything is great is quite dull, and so it doesn't make for engaging fiction. But beginning really with the 20th century, we have a series of differently themed books. Some of them are post-apocalyptic and some of them are dystopian. We talked a little bit about this. So post-apocalyptic stories are ones that essentially imagine a catastrophe and then tell a story about what happens after the catastrophe. And this is a very significant theme in science fiction. There are a lot of, let me see, yeah, so here are two of them that I mentioned. Earth Abides, which involves a epidemic, and Canticle for Leibowitz that involves a nuclear war. Now, when I was thinking about writing about climate change, and I was very much aware of these books, I thought they were unsatisfactory as a subgenre for approaching the subject, because they don't really focus on the cause of the disaster. Rather, what they do is they use the disaster as a premise to clear away the modern world and tell a kind of adventure story. And there are, you know, you're familiar with Mad Max and The Postman, David Brin's book, which was made into a movie, and you know, there's a whole literature about this. And if you look at it, you can see that really the disaster is an excuse for an adventure story. And one of the needs for an adventure story is no bureaucracy. In other words, the subject I teach in my day job, which is administrative law, is the enemy of adventure. Right? What could be more different from adventure than bureaucracy, right? And so when you look at these books, what you see very often, and movies, what you see very often are tropes based on Arthurian literature. Why? Because that's what the Arthurian writers are writing about. So, we think of it as the Middle Ages, but of course, they were writing about a time that occurred about half a millennium or more before the time they were written. This stuff is written in the 12th, 13th, 14th century. Sir Thomas Malory writes Morte d'Arthur at the end of the 15th century, really. And if there was an Arthur, we don't know for sure, but if there was an historical Arthur, he was a figure of the 6th century. So why were they writing about this? Same thing. The High Middle Ages was a time of a lot of politics, very powerful governments. The church was in contest with the emerging nation states, and there wasn't the room for adventure that there had been previously. And of course, this is captured in one of the all-time classics of world literature, Don Quixote, which is about a man who's suffering from nostalgia for the old days of knight errants at a time when that kind of heroism isn't possible. And just to mention two things. So the characters in Arthurian fiction fight with edged weapons. That's really great because a fight goes on a long time. If you have a gun, one good shot and your opponent is dead, right? But edged weapons, you can hack away at each other. And indeed, when they had trial by combat, these guys would fight from sun up till when the stars came out, literally. So they could whack away at each other all day. And the other thing is, somehow, and this goes back to the original King Arthur story, and certainly as reported by Malory, Arthur, at the end, is in charge of an army. He's the King of England, and Mordred has a rebel army. Somehow, at the end, the two of them wind up in face-to-face combat with their edged weapons. Despite these thousands of troops, they're winding up, because of course that's dramatic. So think about Star Wars, right? I mean, Darth Vader's in charge of a whole galaxy, and yet at the end it's him and Luke fighting it out with what? Lightsabers. And it's not only a science fiction, it's an action trope. It's an action conceit. So some of you may have seen the new movie, one of the new movies out, The Revenant. I won't ruin it for you if you haven't seen it, but it's set in, I think, the 1820s, 1830s, and most of the movie, people are shooting around with muskets because that's the weapon they had at the time. So the scene close to the end, the main character, the protagonist, the Revenants, has a best friend who's in fact the captain of a fort. So there's a scene where they go out looking for someone who's lost. This person is harmless. This person is basically a kid who has somehow gotten lost, and they have to go out to find him. So what does the captain do? He's in charge of a fort. He gets 30 or 40 soldiers who he commands, and they go out and they look for this harmless kid. Then at the end of the movie, they have to go out hunting for the villain, who of course is armed. Two of them go out, the captain and the main character. And unless you spent the last 30 years in Mongolia, I don't have to tell you which one of them gets killed before the final showdown. And what happens in the final showdown? Somehow, both the main character and the villain lose their guns. And so the final battle is with a hatchet and a knife, edged weapons. So these Arthurian motifs, pervade action literature throughout, and it's because there's some not only the how cool it is to see a fight with edged weapons, but it's what was appealing to people in the Middle Ages about the Arthurian time is the lack of central government, the disorganization of society, and therefore the need for individual adventure. And that's, the kind of conceit that motivates this whole post-apocalyptic literature. So it's some of it's terrific stuff. Both of these books are good. I think Earth Abides is one of the few, as I mentioned, real literary masterpieces of science fiction genre. But they don't get at the kinds of concerns that we might have about this very real problem we're facing. Now, There's another body of literature, however, that gets closer, and that is dystopian literature. Literature that shows a pessimistic view of the future or an unhappy future as a result of human action. Of course, a nuclear war is human action, but human decisions, and shows a recognizable world, but a world that's in decline. And in the earlier part of the 20th century, this literature was almost exclusively political. That is to say, it showed the unfortunate condition of the future world resulting from political choices that had been made. So the book, well, maybe The Time Machine fits into this, but certainly the one that served as the model for this was Eugene Zamyatin's We, written in Soviet Russia in the early part of the century, and that was a direct model for Orwell's 1984 and possibly for Huxley's Brave New World as well. Starting in the 50s with the book that we discussed, The Space Merchants, there's a shift from politics to environmentalism and resource depletion. The Space Merchants, I believe, is the first book that directly ascribes the unfortunate state of the world to resource depletion. With that comes something else, which is a shift from government to private industry. The private companies are now depicted in control, and they're the ones that are responsible for the deteriorating condition of the world. So in The Space Merchants, as I mentioned, the government has withered away to almost nothing, and it's these giant firms with their giant advertising companies that are in control. The main character, who then has his revelation, is an advertising executive. That's not quite true of Android's Dream of Electric Sheep, but that also has at least some element, it's not clear, of resource depletion. We talked about, to go forward for 1 second, Oryx and Crake has those similar themes, and we talked about that as well. Private companies are in control. This is during the flashback period that immediately precedes the crisis, and that's the same is true for Bacigalupi's The Wind-Up Girl. It's private companies that are in control, and they have resulted in a depleted world. Now, what struck me about those books and about the books that we talked about with respect to flooding is they do, all of them talk about climate change, and all of them talk about the bad consequences that would flow from climate change. These two books, as we talked about, are set in the immediate future, and of course, these are set in a much more distant future. But you notice in neither of these books that we talked about is the climate change itself the motivating factor. Obviously, as a fiction writer, you can make different choices, and those different choices are perfectly fine as a source of fiction, and the book being judged as fiction. The author is generally entitled to whatever premise he or she wants to invoke, and this is sometimes called it was originally, I guess, from French literary criticism, the donné, that is to say, the given. You have to accept the author's donné, and so the donné in Oryx and Crake, of course, is an epidemic caused by direct human intervention. The donné in Bacigalupi's is genetic catastrophe, plants being destroyed by genetic engineering. And in these two books, of course, it's a flood. See, the problem, though, that I perceived when I was thinking about writing something that I hope might have an influence on the debate is that neither of them deal with the basic problem. Flooding is a consequence of global warming. The problem is that there's always been flooding. We talked about this. And in order to ascribe it to global warming, you have to make a statistical argument, which is hard to quite convey to people. In other words, there have always been floods. What the scientists are telling us is that they're going to be more frequent. And that's very serious. Think about New Orleans. So New Orleans is recovering now from Katrina, and it's been just about a decade, right? What would happen if there were another catastrophic flood of the same magnitude? And would people have the energy, the willpower, the willingness to devote resources to rebuild the city again? And then what would happen if there was still another a decade later? At some point, you're not going to get people to move back. And the will and the willingness to rebuild is not going to occur anymore. And so, it's a question of frequency. But that's a little hard to convey because it requires you to think in statistical terms. And these books, while they're very vivid, have to do with a coordinate problem that's somehow connected with the climate change itself. We talked about that. We talked about the fact that genetic engineering is also a case of human intervention into the environment, and so it's linked to the basic problem of climate change, which occurs in both these books but occurs in the background. So I decided that just for the sake of really creating a sort of a impact on, I hoped, on public policy, or something that people who are arguing about public policy could use, that I wanted to write something about just the increase in heat itself and the impact of that. I wanted to focus on that and as the primary problem, and I wanted to set it in a recognizable United States. In other words, not a post-apocalyptic world where people are adventuring across an unorganized landscape and fighting with edge weapons, but a contemporary image of the United States and what might happen to us under this circumstance. So I don't date it. I didn't say when it would occur because I wanted to leave that open or ambiguous. But it's basically these kinds of conditions, maybe a little more serious. Now, I had two coordinate premises that I used to motivate the action. One was coastal flooding, so that does occur. I think in a situation, in a scenario where you had those kinds of increases, I think most people regard that as inevitable. So in my premise, which I got I may have mentioned off a website that does models called Climate Central, my image was that the coastal cities of the United States had been abandoned because of repeated storm surges that essentially made them unviable to live in, and at some point they simply could not maintain that. The other thing I did, and I found that it is, as I started writing it, I began to realize why people weren't writing about heat directly, and that is that it's not a very active threat. So, at some point you wind up with characters sitting around a table talking about, gee, it's awfully hot, maybe we should do something about that. And that, that doesn't work very well novelistically. You wind up with the characters being mouthpieces for the description of the conditions that you want. So I did have a motivating consequence, but I try to be careful to indicate that this was not really what was causing the problem. This was just moving the action along. And the motivating consequence was the development of 3-inch long flesh-eating bugs with a hard shell that makes it impossible basically to pry it off your body once it digs in. So the main character is an entomologist who doesn't actually study these bugs. His job is to avoid insect infestations in his country, but obviously he gets involved with these bugs, and that's what moves this story forward. But the bugs I premised were a consequence of the increase in heat, because they developed, or evolved as carrion feeders once there were so many people dying and so many animals dying from heat. And now they've reached the point where even with the the carcass is gone, they've now moved over to preying on living creatures because they're so aggressive and you can't get them off your body. And so that was the moving factor, and that was where I got my character from. But the underlying cause and the thing I depict as the reason for America's decline is the heat. So this the backstory is that the coastal cities flooded. The center of the country was getting hotter and hotter, and so people from the coastal cities began to move inland as refugees. And this was before the Syrian refugee crisis, but I found that to be rather confirming. It didn't surprise me. So how many are there now? Like 1 million refugees, right? Moving from Syria into Europe. And think about the pressure that's putting on Europe. This is like the #1 crisis in Europe. Every European government is reacting to it. The European Union is reacting to it. There are nativist parties now in just about every European country that are increasing in their popularity as a result of this pressure. 1 million people. Okay, so 7 of our 10 largest metropolitan areas, with a collective population of about 100 million people, or close to it, 70 million, I think, live in coastal cities that will flood under temperature increases such as the ones I showed you in this scenario. This will happen if we get temperature increases. The West Antarctic ice cap will collapse, and we will get sufficiently high sea level rises so that even if these places aren't completely inundated, they will be subject to repeated storm surges and they will not be habitable. And the question was, what will happen to the country if you have not 1 million refugees, but 50 or 60 million refugees? So what I premised is basically that different places would have different reactions to them, but the Midwest, which is closest to the coastal cities, would break off, become a separate country, and become a military dictatorship, which was needed to respond to these refugees by force. In other words, killing them. So the country is broken into 3 parts, which I call the UFA, the Unified Federation of America, Mountain America, where the action starts, and Pacifica. Three successor states. Then the South, and I had sort of fun with this, is below the heat stroke line. And it's almost uninhabitable. There are a small number of people who are occupying these rather small principalities into which the South has broken apart, which are called the Confederacies. Okay. And the place that's really nice, of course, is Canada, right? Because Canada now has a moderate temperate climate, basically the way we used to have. So when the crisis came, this is all backstory, and I try to sort of get it in artfully, but it's easy to present it this way directly. When this refugee crisis came, and before the country broke apart and started killing refugees, the first reaction is to go to Canada and say, well, now you have this lovely climate, and you should take our refugees in. We don't have enough space for them. Our climate is deteriorating. Our ability to handle even our existing population is declining. But you've got all this lovely temperate land in the Northwest Territories and in Upper Saskatchewan. Why don't you take our refugees? And the Canadians, you might imagine, said no. And if we're going to take people in, we'd rather take British and French people who are more allied to our historical and ethnic identity. Yes?
What's the matter with Alaska?
I'll tell you what's the matter with Alaska in 1 second. That's a very good question. Canada said no, and we responded by dropping a nuclear bomb on Montreal and Toronto. Which, again, what would we do under those circumstances? Anyway, we were about to follow up, but we had a civil war, and the country broke into 3 parts. Once that happened, the Canadians invaded us. And they made sure that we wouldn't have any more, these successor states wouldn't have any more nuclear weapons. The other thing they did is they said, okay, we have a wonderful temperate climate. It so happens that the Canadian Shield has no soil. It was scraped clean by those glaciers when the temperature was 6 degrees colder. So it has no, it has no more soil. So what the Canadians did in response is build huge trains and take the soil out of our Midwestern states and put it on the Canadian Shield. And so they now have a very prosperous agriculture in the Canadian Shield. The result is that between Mountain America, which ends at 100-degree west longitude, and the UFA, is a area that used to be our richest farmland, Minnesota, the eastern Dakotas, Iowa, eastern Nebraska, that's now called the enamel. And it's sort of suggestive of the fact that it's bare, but it's actually stands for NML, no man's land. So there's this big area between them that the Canadians have taken the soil and taken out. They also took control of Alaska because their territory is in between us and Alaska. When they invaded us, they took Alaska and New England. And so Canada is a large, prosperous country with a population about double the size of all the successor states in the confederacies. Now, the point of this, of course, you can always spin out variations and imagination and things like this. But the point of this is to really bring home to people that the climate change is going to have serious consequences for 2 things that we care about and that politicians are always talking about, and that you could hear in the current political debate: our prosperity and our power. And so this was an effort to confront people with the potential decline of American prosperity and American power as a result of the fact that climate change, I mean, the first impacts are going to be obviously in the tropics and are going to be in low-lying areas in the tropical world. We talked a little bit about what might happen in Bangladesh. But if you get increases, if there's no effort to control it and you get increases of the sort depicted on that chart, our own climate is going to be severely affected for the worse. And this will be the consequence. So in the confederacies, you can only live, the temperatures during the summers are fatal levels, and you can only live if the air conditioning keeps running. And so they have power plants. No conservation, they're just burning more coal. There's coal, plenty of coal in the south. And each of these small principalities has a couple of giant power plants which are running the air conditioners that they need to keep their relatively small populations alive. The action in the story begins with now, all the beta bugs live only below the heat stroke line. They only live in hot weather. So they only live, essentially the heat stroke line, you can think of it as the Mason-Dixon line. So they only live in the confederacies. And our main character, his name is Daniel Danton, our main character is, as he starts off, is an entomologist, and he's been called to a meeting. It turns out there's been an outbreak of biter bugs in eastern Montana, in the farmlands of eastern Montana, where they're growing coffee and grapefruit and oranges. Okay, so there's he is sent by the president of Mountain America, one of these successor states, with several other people, to negotiate with the UFA in Columbus, Ohio, which they think, because it has a sort of aggressive antagonistic regime, may have been responsible for this. And the UFA's reaction at first is one of extreme hostility, and it looks like there's going to be a war. So that's where it starts. In the middle of this, Dante, who's an academic entomologist, gets a wonderful offer to give a paper at the one of the most prestigious universities in North America, which is the University of South Baffin Island, which is a lovely place now. And so he goes up there and he gives a paper, and they offer him a position on the faculty, which is very flattered, but of course he has a family and he doesn't want to leave where he lives. He goes back, and then he's given another mission to, they sort of develop an understanding with the UFA, and the UFA tells them, look, we didn't cause it. Where do you think the biter bugs came from? They came from somewhere in the Confederacies, because they're the people with the bugs. So look into that. So they do, and they get a contact, and they send Dante down with his friend, who's a historian of American politics, to investigate this contact and see if they can find out where the biter bugs come from. Dante and his friend are captured and taken to a facility where he's tied to a chair, and he watches his friend being tortured to death by having biter bugs released on him. And this is the first time I actually describe these things, so they've been in the background. This is the first time I've described them. The person in charge of this is wearing a leopard suit, and so he thinks of her as the leopard pattern suit, as the leopard woman, and she's never named in the book, so she's always like the leopard woman. But his friend is tortured to death. They put him in the same place as if they're going to torture him to death, but after they have one bug attack him, they release him, and it turns out that he's not going to be tortured. He's taken then to one of the confederacies. It's Birmingham, which is now called Birmingham, Victoria, the northern half of Alabama, where he finds out why he's been captured. They want him to work at a lab which they claim is designed to figure out a way to control biter bugs through genetic engineering. So he's placed in this lab, and at the end of the day, each day, he's put in a prison. But they tell him, if you're cooperative, we'll put you in a home. So 6 weeks later, they transfer him to a home. Now, he thinks he's going to be put in a home with... There are two men who are a same-sex couple. One of them, they're both very strong men. One of them happens to be the office manager of the lab. So he's always carrying stuff around. The other one is a scientist, but he happens to be 6'6". So he assumes that if they're going to move him to a private home, they're going to put him with these two guys, who are actually very nice guys and very friendly to him, but obviously people who he's not going to physically overwhelm. Instead, he finds himself in an ordinary suburban-type family. A sort of pudgy guy, his wife, and two children. Two girls, an 18-year-old and a 12-year-old girl. And this is where he's placed. And it turns out that the reason he was placed there is that the man is the brother-in-law of the security, of the head of the security operation that captured him. Anyway, and that's where a lot of the action takes place. Now, the man's job is, he's a food specialist, he says. And Danton originally thinks, oh, that's great. My wife does that too. I worry about food because I'm trying to deal with bug infestations. He says, no, you got it wrong. We don't deal with the production of food. We deal with the cultural meaning of food. What I do is have investigators who go around, and remember, this is a tiny principality, right, that's under enormous pressure. we go around and we investigate to make sure that people are cooking American food. And if they're not cooking American food, then we intervene and we stop them from cooking what they're doing. And ultimately, what he tries to do is he asks Dante, what kind of pests destroy rice crops? And Dante starts telling him. Dante loves to talk about insects, so every time you get him going, he starts talking about insects. So he tells, and after a while, he says, I'm not sure I'm understanding your question. And this guy says, no, you're not understanding it. I don't want to protect the rice crops. I want you to find a bug to destroy them because these people are using rice to make non-American dishes like congee and pilaf. And so we want to destroy their rice crops. So the point is that there's this kind of hyper-patriotic mania because these people have lost their country. They've been reduced to this powerless, impoverished condition. And their response is a kind of maniacal patriotism. One of the other scenes takes place on December 25th, which is celebrated as Battle of the Bulge Day in this principality, where they celebrate the American victory over the Germans and the Russians in World War II. When Dante points out that actually the Russians were our allies and we were fighting the Germans and the Italians, the guy gets very angry at him and says, no, that's wrong, that's Canadian propaganda. We were fighting the Germans and the Russians. So I tried to depict this kind of, what kind of responses, emotional responses people would have to the decline of our country and to their reduction to this very impoverished and subservient condition. The other thing is everybody carries a gun strapped around their waist in the Confederacies. But it's not a gun to shoot each other. It's a stun gun to hit the biter bugs with, because the only way to get them off your body once they latch on is with an electric shock. So everyone has to carry a gun, but it's because of the biter bugs. I won't tell you the denouement, but the other thing I did, and it was something that, I think when writers say, "Oh, the book wrote itself," I don't think that's what happens. But there was something that came to me as I was writing along, which was a character. When he first goes to this home, the 12-year-old girl is very pretty, and she's very ebullient, and she sort of tries to make friends with him because he's this person from far away, and but she's just basically a 12-year-old kid. That's her, by the way. The older girl is very quiet, and he doesn't even notice her. There's almost no description. And then around the middle of the book, she starts talking to him, and they develop this kind of mysterious relationship. She turns out to be extremely perceptive, but also somebody who is sort of in despair. He can't figure out what it is, but she has this very disconnected kind of mystical quality. She hardly ever talks when the family is together, but she starts talking to him. They share an interest in literature, and after a while, he realizes that he's become really emotionally dependent on her. She's 18. He's afraid that he's sexually attracted to her, and he actually goes through a process of trying to introspect, and he realizes that this is something else. It's not sexual. There's something that has reached, in a way, a deeper place in him. And so in the process of talking to her, she tells him that, he asks her finally, at first she's so perceptive that he winds up being in a kind of subordinate role to her. Namely, he's listening to her. After all, he realizes that this is a human relationship. He should reach out. So he asks her, well, what do you do during the day? I mean, what is it? You're living in this house. You're so knowledgeable and perceptive, and I don't see you doing anything. She basically says, I have nothing much to do, but I write escapist fiction. And so he says, well, I'd like to read it. And after a particularly traumatic scene involving some action, in fact, involving the reappearance of the leopard woman, she gives him the first 3 chapters of her book, which are than printed in the novel. And her book is a post-apocalyptic adventure story with all the tropes. In fact, I loaded it up with sci-fi cliches. So they start off underground in a kind of set of spaces controlled by a computer, by a master computer. This has been done maybe 50 times in science fiction. And then, sure enough, the main character that this girl creates is interested in what? In freedom, in escape. Everybody else is conventional, but she wants to break away. You know, think of the Hunger Games, think of Divergent, think of all this. It's a standard trope. And she ultimately does, and she gets up to the surface. And on the surface, there's a kind of a pastoral jungle situation with little villages that are fighting each other. And she goes to one of the villages, and the action, she meets this very handsome guy. And that's where it ends. That's as much as she's written. But you can, you know, the reader can obviously write in his or her mind how this is going to play out because it follows these tropes. So the point was to contrast this post-apocalyptic fiction with the real situation. And in fact, to continue the kind of mystical connection, he's very surprised that she wrote this kind of book. He expected, since she's so perceptive, something like William James or Jane Austen. So he's troubled by it and what it tells him about her. And this gives him the clue. This gives him the realization about what the lab is really about and how he can escape and get back to his family. So this mystical connection continues. And and plays out to the conclusion of the book. Anyway, that's what I tried to do as a novelistic way of having people confront or deal with at least one possible set of realities that would result if we don't do anything about this problem. If we keep saying that 95% of the climate scientists in the world are perpetuating a hoax, and that there's really no problem, despite some of the largest computer models in the world that accurately predict changes in temperature to 1/10 of a degree and are telling us, or 100th of a degree actually, and are telling us that there's a huge problem. And so that's what I tried to do. I'd be glad to take questions about the process before I go on to talk about the other books, about the process of writing it and what was behind it. And yeah.
Well, I just had a question about what you said earlier about the equilibrium, because I had always imagined that the heat was the greenhouse effect, and that the heat from the sun was entering and not being able to leave. So, but you mentioned that there's the surface temperature of the Earth.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a perfectly good way to think about it. And that's all really that you need in order to sort of understand the process. But what's actually happening is it's a question of how hot the Earth has to be to radiate enough heat into its surroundings to maintain an equilibrium between the incident heat, which is 240 watts hitting the surface, and the heat that is being sent off into space. In other words, the world must, because of the laws of thermodynamics, generate radiate 240 watts of heat. And so in order to do that radiation, the surface has to get warmer. So that's the more technical explanation for why that happens. That's why Venus is so hot. That blanket of carbon dioxide means that Venus, even though it would only be 50 degrees hotter than our world based on its closer proximity to the sun. If there were no greenhouse effect, we would be average temperature 0 degrees centigrade, and Venus would be at 50, not very hot. But because of the blanket, in fact, Venus has to, surface temperature has to be 500 degrees centigrade in order to radiate enough heat to stay in balance because of the blanket of carbon dioxide. So that's just, was there, yes?
What do you think of Michael Crichton's novel, State of Fear?
I couldn't get through it. I mean, I thought it was irresponsible. I mean, he's a wonderful, he's a wonderful pop novelist, but and he has a great imagination. But I don't know exactly what motivated him to write it. It's the only anti-climate change novel I'm familiar with. Jim Inhofe has made it required reading for his staff, and I don't know much about it, but I didn't think novelistically, as I started reading, it was very good. And after a while, I just felt that, this was not something I could read. I thought it was an irresponsible thing to do. Yes?
My daughter, who just kind of studies everything, before the situation became so obvious that it was global warming and that it would get so bad, that we were actually shifting poles, and that the North Pole was going to become the South Pole, and the South Pole the North Pole. And she claimed that it had happened before. So, what are the, I don't know how many gazillion years it takes for that to happen, but what about that?
Yeah, so again, I'm not a scientist and I don't know that much about it. I've tried to educate myself about this problem because I think it's so serious. There has been alterations in the Earth's magnetic field. It occurs actually on fairly short time scales, tens of thousands of years. There are several science fiction books that deal with those kinds of environmental or geological problems. There's one where the Earth stops rotating, and there's another one about reversals of magnetic polarity. And they're interesting premises, but those are the kinds of things like when we talked about the drowned world, where the heat is caused by a solar flare. I mean, they're great premises to write about, but as a policy matter, if it happens, there's nothing we're going to be able to do about it. Dystopia, as a sort of technical term for literature, is usually considered to be a bad future condition resulting from human choices that we can make. So the earlier dystopian novels were choices about politics, the acceptance of a totalitarian regime, or in Huxley, becoming so sybaritic that we didn't care about politics anymore. And the recent dystopian novels are about decisions about things like climate, global warming, or genetic engineering that we could avoid. So that, and that's the kind of book I want to write, yes?
She also believes, not with your bite of bugs, but that the natural world will respond much better than the human world to these changes. Because I was talking about my garden, and since the bees are not pollinating the way they used to, and so on. And she said, well, you'll just have a different kind of garden. It doesn't mean there won't be one.
Right.
And it may come a different time of year, or it may come twice a year. But that world will probably not be in the same danger that we will be.
Well, you see, that's interesting because it's a question of what constitutes danger and at what level. So it's obvious that many, many animals are right now in enormous danger. In fact, they're in danger of extinction. And this is something observable. So, for example, if spring comes earlier, things start blooming earlier, and animals that depend on those blooms are off cycle. Or we've observed animals who live in mountainous areas having to progressively move up the mountain in order to be in the same temperature range that they were in lower down before the warming occurred, and things like that. So there's no question there'll be a lot of extinctions. Now, it is probably true that the natural world will adapt in the sense that new species will evolve. So, it's how nostalgic you feel about existing species. But of course, the real issue is us. So we have developed this world to a point where we depend on its being pretty much exactly as it is. If there are variations, it won't mean that all plant life will be wiped out. But boy, if the level of productivity of corn decreases, we're talking about 1 billion people dying of famine. I mean, in other words, we have populated the world to a point where, the kinds of cycles that nature goes through and the kinds of exterminations that occur are part of the natural cycle in the past, but we're dependent on a set of conditions that has enabled us to populate the world with 7 billion people. And if those conditions start changing, we're going to feel it, and we're going to feel it in ways. And that was sort of the point of my book. It doesn't have to be that everybody gets wiped out. It's when you get stress on these systems that will we be able to maintain our prosperity? Will we be able to maintain our political situation? What would happen to us if we had to respond with violence to millions of refugees? What would that do to the political structure in the United States? Could we still have open debate and open elections when we were in that kind of militaristic stance? So those are the kinds of questions I wanted to raise in the book. Yes?
I was just wondering about your use of the biblical names, because, okay, so I understand in the Confederate States, I mean, you would think, well, okay, you're in the Bible. But then, you get to the protagonist's children's names. Well, those are all biblical names.
Right.
You've got Joshua,
Right.
Michael,
Right.
etc. But his wife's name is Jeronica or something.
Right, Guernica. Yeah. Okay.
So was there some?
So here's what I did. I assumed that there had been a revivalist movement when the climate change began, and people turned to religion. And then the problem was that the climate change went on, and so most people lost faith in this revivalism. The remnant of it is that boys still have biblical names, and that was a quote-unquote revivalist, but girls don't. So the girls all have unusual modern-type names, but the boys are all given these biblical names. In the Confederacies, everyone has a biblical name, and that's why the female character is named Deborah. Now, there were several other things I did, and it's an interesting question. I wanted to avoid making this heavy-handed, but I found that using symbolic structures or references to literature was a way of aiding my own imagination. So Daniel is obviously a reference to Daniel in the lion's den, and he's also put into a furnace. Part of the denouement involves black helicopters coming from Canada to rescue him. And the helicopters are labeled with the name of a Canadian university that the people in the South have been raiding for the equipment in the lab. It's Mid-Manitoba Technical University, MMTU, and that's what's labeled on the helicopters. That is Mene Mene Tekel Upharsin, the handwriting on the wall in the book of Daniel. But his last name is Danton. And I also used Dante's Inferno as imagery. So all through, there are images of the Inferno. Now the Inferno begins with Dante, the main character, in the middle of his life, lost in a forest. He's attacked by 3 animals, a lion, a wolf, and a leopard. And then Virgil comes and takes him on a tour through the Inferno. The head of the lab, who's a vicious guy who really oppresses Dan, is Dr. Lyons. The head of the security agency who's captured him is Wolfson, and this woman is the leopard lady. I mean, I could use Lyons and Wolf Wolfson because those are ordinary names, but nobody is named Leopard. And so if I wanted to use that, I had to come up with some way to refer to her as a leopard without saying Mrs. Leopard, which would sound idiotic, right? So he sees her the first time. She dresses very elegantly. She's sort of a really vicious, cold, punishing character. You've seen them in the movies too. So the first time he sees her, she's in a leopard print dress. And from then on, he calls her the leopard woman. The one other thing I did, and it was almost my own use. I don't know, I wasn't exactly sure of how redemptive this young girl who he develops the relationship is supposed to be, but I wanted to at least fix it in my mind. The one redemptive scene in the Inferno is when they have to go through one of the gates and a messenger comes down from heaven. An angel comes down from heaven, walks through the Inferno, opens the gate for Virgil and for Dante. And the poet uses this image of all the evil people in the sight of an angel scattering, except one of them who freezes like frogs running out of a pond, except one of them who freezes in place. So there's one scene where Dan and Deborah go out to have a conversation in the backyard. And there's a little pond there, and all the frogs run away, except one frog which freezes in place as Deborah approaches. So, if you're a real Dante fan, maybe you would see it. I wasn't interested really in that kind of heavy-handed. It was almost like something like if you draw a painting, you have an underlying sketch that you use to sort of design the painting. I almost used some of that Inferno imagery just to do that. I mean, it's also fun. I mean, there's one guy, the president of Birmingham, Victoria, comes on the internet at one point to talk about an event, and I gave him the name of a character from the Inferno, adapted. The character carries his head in his hands, and it's the head that talks. It's one of the best images, actually, in the story. So when he comes on the television, Daniel says, well, won't that influence people? And the guy staying with us says, no, he's just a talking head. So, but that, I didn't try to use that to carry the story in any way. It was just sort of for a way to generate imagery. And you can't do much better than one of the greatest geniuses in all of literature in terms of inspiring you with images. So I figured that would help a little.
Why did you have the little boy die?
Which?
Danton's little boy.
Oh, he's sick at the beginning, and the implication is that there are diseases now that are going around that weren't there before. In fact, there's even a little bit of hard science explication that there are these bacteria that live within us called commensals, I think, that we need for survival. And I premised that some of these things would die off if there was ambient heat is greater. And so when Daniel is captured, he has 3 children, and when Daniel is captured, his youngest child, his son, is ill, and in fact dies while Daniel is away in being captured. But it's presumed from that, and that's exactly the action starts actually with the family going to a clinic to try to deal with this boy. But that was a way of creating a kind of a tragic sense about the situation. Yeah.
3-part question.
Okay.
When did you write? When did this come out, and how long did it take you to write it? And have you gotten some reaction from?
Well, people who have read it have liked it. I've gotten a couple of reviews. I would like to get it in the hands of some people who are dealing with the policy aspects of it, because I really did write it for a didactic purpose. I mean, I really wanted to present people. I just noticed there was no book that really brought home the impact of America on at least one scenario for the actual problem itself, not floods, not genetic engineering, but just the increase in temperature. So that's what I did. It was published a few months ago. It took me about 1.5 years to write. I was, I have a day job, so I was doing it at night. But it was really a pleasure to do a different kind of writing and to sit down and, because one of the things about writing law review articles is the editors make you have citations for almost every statement you make, much more than other forms of academic writing. You have to footnote almost everything. So to write something that I didn't have to footnote was, a lot of fun. Yes?
Do you have plans for a follow-up book of any sort?
I've thought about it. I haven't quite decided. The publisher is actually doing a collection of short stories on climate change and has invited the authors that publish with him to write a short story. And so I'm thinking I might try my hand at that. But I'm also planning to write a book about judicial review, and so that will probably take precedence. Yes.
How did your day job segue into all this science fiction?
Well, it's interesting. So when I started, it was, and this is a story I think about the way academics think. When I started, it was, I want a break from what I do, and I've been doing so much reading and writing in my field that I'm not doing any recreational reading. So actually, with my grown son, who's now a graduate student, we decided that we would together read science fiction as a kind of, kid-dad thing, and we both needed recreational reading. So I started doing this purely recreationally. Then I happened to mention it, and it was suggested to me that I do the Freshman Commons course on visions of the future in science fiction. So I started teaching it. Then people in the law school heard about the course, and they wanted to create a book club in the law school about it. And then this two started merging. So now I find that when I write my law review stuff, I can often drop footnotes. They want all these footnotes out. I'll give you a footnote. It'll be a footnote to science fiction. So, illustratively, because, this is, as I mentioned before, it is a literature of imagination. And, the people who write it have very powerful imaginations. They're not always the best at characters. They're not always the best at prose, but the imagination. And so they give us different visions that really are illuminating about what might happen under different circumstances. I mean, privatization, for example, is a really important theme in modern, and commercialization. And all, these are issues that we have to deal with on a public policy basis. And so, science fiction really does provide some insight into what might happen or what we might want to avoid. So the two sort of merged after a while. Yes?
Who is your publisher?
Sunbury Press. It's a small press in Pennsylvania. What happened was I had just written it. I had written it. I didn't think about getting it published or something like that. I wrote a blog for Salon, which is a website, where I mentioned this point about post-apocalyptic fiction not addressing the real issue. And I got an email from a guy who runs a climate change blog. He says, "Why don't you write a novel, your own novel about this?" I wrote him back and I said, "I did write a novel." So he wrote back and said, "Okay, send it to me, I'll get it published." So at that point, I finished it. I hadn't finished it. I finished it in a weekend, sent it to him, and he got it published. So very briefly, I just want to mention, I only have a couple of minutes, so let me just mention, because I just wanted to refer to them. Two other books that have been published recently that also deal with the United States climate getting hotter as the primary problem. Interestingly, though, neither of them depicts the heat itself. What they both depict I mean, they start off, well, Polar City Red doesn't depict the heat at all. In Arc does depict it at the beginning, but both of them talk about refuges. So in Polar City Red, the refuge is a development. It's not really a city, it's a small settlement under a dome that was built originally for research and military purposes and now serving as a refuge for people who are fleeing from the United States. In Arc, the arc of the title is a kind of mysterious refuge. It's actually near New York, where the main character, like my main character, gets kidnapped and transported there. But they seem very nice to her, unlike in my situation. And after a while, you get the sense that there's something a little sinister going on. But both of these are about life in these refuges. So again, it's about warming, but the warming takes place in the background. And it's really about life in the refuges and the kind of events that occur. Both of them have an interesting connection. They assume, and it may be pretty accurate, and it's like the Quakers. They, in Arcs and Quake, they assume that in a refuge, you're going to have to plan childbearing. That you cannot just have anymore a normal sexual relationships, but you need to actually get women impregnated by some sort of schedule and some sort of plan. And so in Polar City Red, it's a family that flees to this place, and they want to enroll the wife in this breeding program, and the main character resists, and that's some of the action. In Arc, the main character is a woman. She's a single woman. She actually is impregnated and has to deal with it, and ultimately flees from the Arc, partially motivated by this. But it's an interesting premise about if we wind up in refuges, we're going to have to think differently about social relations, because we'll be in an environment that has to be very tightly controlled in order for us to manage those refuges. And so I think both authors are telling us, you know, maybe humanity will survive, but a lot of the things that we value about humanity may not. And of course, that's a theme in Arcs and Quake. Also, the Quakers are going to do fine in this world. They are immune to the disease, they eat grass, and they have a few other modifications that enable them to go do fine while almost all humanity has been wiped out, but at a cost to what we think of as central to humanity. And that's, you know, that I think is an important theme. In my book, it was the cost to our political sensibilities and our sense of human rights and our sense of truth and our sense of the way we want to govern ourselves that collapsed under pressure of this situation. Okay, we're at the time. I don't want to hold you over, but thank you.
Thank you very much. Somebody asked